Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome all of you to day 168 of Humanity Rising, an initiative of Ubiquity University and 315 partnering organizations from all over the world that arose last spring as the pandemic was intensifying globally and forcing most of us into some kind of lockdown and engaging in social distancing and wearing masks and becoming acutely aware of our own personal and community health. Every day, we have been providing an open space so people can come together to share their experiences, their aspirations, their solutions, and their strategies to ensure that we can use the crisis of the pandemic as an opportunity for human renewal at every level of human existence in a world in which the crises are intensifying, and scientists are telling us that we have a diminishing time frame to rectify humanity's relationship to the larger ecosystem, or we will lose the world as we know it. Every day we start our program with a pause. It's a crazy world out there. A lot of challenges need to be faced.
Jim, there was a glitch. You need to start over. Go ahead. Just take it from the top.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to day 168 of Humanity Rising, an initiative of Ubiquity University and over 300 partnering organizations from all over the world that have come together during this extraordinary pandemic to provide an open space on a daily basis so that people worldwide can come together to share their experiences, their solutions, their visions, and their strategies to ensure that we can use the crisis of the pandemic as an opportunity for human renewal. Let us begin, as we always do, with a moment of heart coherence. It's a crazy world out there. We want to come together as we start this session. Take a few deep breaths, close your eyes, and place your attention on your heart. See if you can listen to your own heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive at this extraordinary moment in our human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart, I want to commence our program for today. I'm sure all of you watched the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris yesterday, as bottles of champagne were uncorked all over the world, and the human race was able to breathe a sigh of relief that the worst president in over 200 years of United States history is gone. A man who, from the Oval Office of the White House, for 4 years, attempted to subvert American democracy, but in the end, even after he tried to stage what they refer to as a self-coup to maintain power in the face of a democratic election, American democracy stood strong. And the votes were counted. The people spoke. The courts, in every single instance, verified that the election was fair, honest, and accurate. And the Congress of the United States, even after an insurrection, which momentarily took over the Capitol building and forced the senators and the representatives into hiding, the vice president had to escape. Even in the face of that, the Congress, before the day was done, had verified that the election was true. And yesterday, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris became president and vice president of the United States. It was a great day for America, and it was a great day for the world, because democracy has to be considered by everyone, everywhere, without exception, as the foundation, the cornerstone of governance. One of the first things that the new president did, which was broadcast live from the Oval Office, was to sign a slew of executive orders reversing some of the most egregious actions of Donald Trump. And principal among those was to return the United States to the Paris Climate Accords, which Donald Trump had canceled 4 years ago. We've often said on the program that at the heart of the crises facing humanity is climate change, and the fact that global warming is now accelerating to such an extent that many scientists are saying that, in fact, the climate emergency has spun out of control and is irredeemable. At a minimum, it's a crisis that needs urgent attention. As Joe Biden and Kamala Harris said, there is no time to waste. And that's why as soon as they entered the White House, they got to work. And on Humanity Rising, that's what we're doing. We took the day off to celebrate democracy, and now we need to get down to work because we have little time to save ourselves. And the most urgent challenge is climate change. So we've invited two people to join us today. that will be speaking about the climate emergency. And in fact, I want to introduce Margaret Klein Salamon, who's a PhD in clinical psychologist, who wrote the book, The Climate Emergency. And I was particularly captivated, Margaret, by your subtitle, how you can transform yourself with climate truth. That's what the world needs to do. Because up to this moment, there's not a single government in the world that has actually taken in climate truth. And that's why, as Coleridge put it, we're slouching toward Armageddon. So, Margaret, I'm delighted to have you here the first day after the inauguration to talk to us with Jeremy Lent, who you'll introduce in a moment, about how we can collectively use the truth about climate change to transform our perceptions, our politics, and the future of humanity at this critical time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, everyone. I'm unfortunately, my voice is a little scratchy today. I have a cold, but I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for bearing with me. So I invited Jeremy Lent to come and talk on this program. Jeremy Lent is an author. His book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, came out, I think, last year, 2 years ago, and was very well received. George Monbiot, the environmentalist, called it the most important book he had ever read, which is high praise. And his upcoming book is The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. Jeremy's also an activist. We met through our work with the Climate Mobilization, which is an organization that I founded and directed for about 6 years. And, the climate emergency and climate is almost always discussed from a scientific or policy or political perspective, right? It's extremely rational conversations that really leave out a great deal in terms of emotions, the self, how social life, and the idea of meaning, what this all means. So I'm really pleased to have Jeremy here so that we can discuss the climate emergency in this other way.
Yeah, well, hi, Margaret. So excited to be in conversation with you. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be joining you here. So thanks.
All right. So the main topic that I want us to cover today is about self-conception. Mm-hmm. The idea, how do we as individuals make sense of, we wake up every day and what does it mean? Why are we here? And what is the point? And so Jim was talking about the inauguration. And so I'm wondering if maybe we could start there and think if we could speculate a little bit about Trump's self-concept and Biden's self-concept and how they, what does it mean to them to be alive and to be like a good person? And yeah,
that's an interesting perspective, isn't it? I mean, there have been so many articles written about the narcissistic pathology of the outgoing thankfully ex-president. And so not wanting to give too much space to him, but I guess really we should be relieved in a way that he was so narcissistic that he actually failed to turn his authoritarian possibility into reality. And I think, one thing I really like share with everyone, this sense of incredible relief, this existential relief of at least a temporary reprieve from utter disaster for our world. And for Americans, we have to realize how close that reprieve was. It wasn't a landslide. It wasn't like, so much of a foregone conclusion. And the fact it was so close, and the fact it was probably only the incredible narcissistic incompetence of that sort of tin pot dictator wannabe that actually allowed enough of the sort of other powers to fall apart, to actually move us forward to this place. It's something we need to be very, very aware of. And then, to your question, I feel a certain sort of nuanced relief about Joe Biden being in this role, and I'm absolutely just like anybody else with any sort of sense of reason, what a relief, and so enjoying that sense of that calm, stability and all the feelings he's putting out and that sense of unity. And at the same time, we need to recognize that he is coming from a sense of self that's embedded in a system that is really leading us to destruction. We need to recognize that something transformative has to change for us to shift the direction we're going in. And, I'm a little bit concerned, and I just kind of put this out, and we can maybe discuss it a little bit more. We need to be careful not to get too much lulled into the sense of, oh, okay, now we're back to some sort of normalcy again. We've got, things as they should be. There's the normal that we had before this ridiculous, brutal wannabe dictator came into place was not normal. It was driving us to destruction. And now we're 4 years further ahead on that path to destruction. And we need to recognize that it's so great that the country is now back in the Paris Agreement. Absolutely. And we also need to recognize the Paris Agreement itself is totally insufficient to move us into the direction we're going in. And we need to go further than that. So I'm sort of holding a sense of this shared relief. And of course, we'll deserve to feel that relief after 4 years of just such brutality and just working through the sort of rampage in our souls. And we have to be realizing that this is just the beginning now of the potential for true transformative change.
So as you mentioned, Trump has been written about and certainly is a narcissist. And just to expand on that a little bit and what that means, and because I agree with you, his narcissism was a huge barrier to being effective, but it also, I think, was a huge part of why his supporters loved him. Because that's a kind of a way of being in the world that they resonate with and share. So my understanding of what it's like to live in that kind of mind is being preoccupied all the time with shoring up yourself, right? And the way to do that is by putting down other people and showing that you're superior to them and getting accolades and whatnot. But it has to be. It's not I'm great and we're all great. It's I'm the greatest. These are whoever it is disgusting and or pathetic or. Yeah, so I'm afraid this kind of self-concept is really not uncommon in this country. might even be the most common like personality type.
I think that is such an interesting point that you raise. In a way, we can see Trump was really touching into the sort of the pinnacle of exactly what the sort of American personality type actually endorses and actually sort of says that this is how we're meant to live our life and this is how we're meant to be. And in fact, in a way, if we do say contrast Trump with some of those actual more successful authoritarian fascist leaders of the 1930s, like somebody like Hitler or Mussolini, they were more like feeling into the sense of a shared nationalism, not so much the individual narcissism, but the nationalism of that kind of totalitarian thinking. But this is a sort of unique type of fascism that Trump has been representing in the United States because it is about narcissism. And I think, to your point, to go then deeper, we need to recognize that there is this sense of self. Actually, it's a really a Western sense of self that's become sort of globalized through the Western hegemony now of a culture throughout the world, but is really at its pinnacle in the United States. Is a sense of self as this adamantine, boundaried existence that is separate from everything else around. A sense of self that says, like me, and maybe I'll include my family, is what I'm meant to be looking out for. Look out for number one.
Rugged individualism.
Exactly, that rugged individualism. And that's something that has been exacerbated so much by the whole consumerist push by corporate marketing ever since the beginning of the 20th century, when marketers first developed the sophistication of trying to really keep people on the sense of this kind of hedonic treadmill of really getting people to focus on the self, always feel dissatisfied about the self, and always buy more and do more in order to enhance the self. And we're so used to that in the media and in conversations and in society, and more in the United States than anywhere else, but even in Europe or any other, and most countries in the world at this point, that's the dominant way of thinking, which has led to this whole notion of neoliberalism, where you have somebody like Margaret Thatcher, I mean, kind of mind-blowingly saying, there is no such thing as society. There is just individuals and their families, and that's it. And people actually have developed a global system based on that individual self. And that is actually I think, a core of the pathway that our culture is leading towards destruction. So I think it would be really good to really look at the implications of that. And in fact, what I think is so fascinating, and maybe we can unpack this a little bit, is to recognize how there are other conceptions of self that are actually there in culture, in historical culture, and also how modern science and understanding of actual who we are as human beings shows how wrong that conception actually is from just an ontological perspective, not just from a moral perspective.
Great. Yeah, I agree with what you said. I just want to add, Erich Fromm, the wonderful psychoanalyst and writer from the 50s, and spoke about how capitalism, not just advertising as you're describing, which is totally accurate, but that it turns us all into commodities that we're trying to like sell on the market, and not just, for get a job, but even for something like find a romantic partner, that the way we approach it is this really like mercenary, well, I need to be this attractive and this charming and this whatever, have these attributes, and then I can get someone with like a similar, value, and yeah, to just be constantly evaluating and kind of, yeah, just looking at ourselves in the way that a whatever a business person would look at an investment.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and it's really bleak. And I know, because I lived the first, I don't know, 20 plus years of my life like that, just, so focused on my resume, and also this kind of proof even before Facebook, but just, trying to present, like, look at all my friends that I have, and here's a picture of us smiling and having fun, and like just this kind of self-marketing.
That's right. Yeah. And so I think you're right also that this focus on the self and the sort of narcissistic elements of the self, and look how much fun I'm being seen to have in Facebook and all the rest of it, has led to young people around the world actually having more neurotic tendencies, significantly more than a few decades back. So there are studies that show that somebody who is considered normal now, if they took the same battery of tests 30 or 40 years ago, would be considered in the kind of severe side of neurotic or narcissistic, and especially in the place of narcissistic. So I think it's really important to understand that. And at the same time, I'd even go deeper back into history too. Because I think one of the things that we're less aware of is how embedded this sense of the self as a separate sort of adamantine kind of individuality is so there in Western culture, all the way back to from millennia, basically, in the whole sort of Christian way of looking at reality, ultimately coming from the ancient Greeks. But so, something I find so interesting, if you just think about, say, the traditional medieval or sort of pre-scientific Christian notion of the soul, which obviously even today a lot of people still have some sort of belief in. But what we're told in sort of mainstream Christianity is that if you're a good person, like you have this eternal soul within you, and your body is really something that just dies. The soul is what is truly you as a self. And if you're really good, you'll end up in heaven. But then what people don't even look at is, well, what about how if your soul was in heaven and somebody that you loved on that earth didn't make it to heaven, how are you meant to feel about that person suffering in hell? And believe it or not, in theology, in mainstream theology in the 18th, 19th century, they'd have these discussions and they say, well, maybe God, what he does is he sort of kind of purges those memories you have of those other people that were now in hell. So you could just be in this eternal bliss and all these kind of crazy ideas. And I think that what it shows is how deeply embedded this sense is that we exist as these separate individuals with some sort of part of us that is unique. And that's what we're meant to be looking out for. So even deeper than the rise of capitalism, which really came really through this sort of Protestant ethic, so that there's this kind of real linkage between some of the core Christian ideas, moving to Protestantism and then moving to capitalism. But I think what is so fascinating is that in other cultures around the world, there's a totally different sense of what a self is. So, if we look at East Asian culture, traditional Chinese way of making sense of self, or outside of China, just any East Asian way, the sense of self is really something that is formed through relationships. So if you ask somebody in East Asian culture to actually sort of discuss themselves, they talk about it in relationship, like, oh, I'm a member of this family, and here's how I am in relation to the family, and I'm a member of this community, and here's my role in the company I work. And everything is kind of defined and referenced in terms of sets of relationships, which actually can expand even to the living earth. So there's a sense of self actually being part of all of life and part of Earth, and sort of in this interconnected way, which in itself, I talk about East Asian thought, but there's also, that was really a continuation of indigenous thought that we see all around the world in indigenous communities today, no matter where it might be. It could be North America or South America, Africa, or Australia. What we see is the indigenous sense of self is very much about relationship. There's even this wonderful phrase from the Lakota, where mitakuye oyasin is what they'll declare in ceremony, which basically means all my relations, or we are all related. So that is the fundamental sense. And of course, if you begin to sense yourself in that regard, that leads to a whole different set of values, a whole different set of ways in which you act in the world. And if our society, cumulatively began to see ourselves more in that way, just imagine how that would shift in terms of the policies and the values we'd put out there.
And also it creates a much better just life for the people who, I mean, it makes me think back to when I was a teenager, and I would be like devastated to have acne. And it's like, and that makes sense if you're a commodity, you know, and like, wow, my market value is so down. But instead, if you know, I'm a sister and a daughter, and this is my school, and this is, you know, then it's like, oh, well, maybe not the biggest issue. Like it just, I think it feels so much better to care less for yourself, or not so exclusively, and to focus on relationships. I'm interested also, Jeremy, in just hearing about you know, your evolution in your sense of self. Did you also have a narcissistic early life?
Yeah, you know, it was interesting because I grew up in England, grew up in the Jewish community in England, and there was a different kind of neurosis that I experienced, which was that in England, as opposed to in the United States, the Jewish community, especially in the generation I grew up, sort of felt it was kind of there on sufferance, if you will. My parents had lived through, they were in England, which is the reason they survived, but sort of knowing about the Holocaust. And I was born in 1960, growing up in the sort of post-Holocaust generation. But what I got from my parents and the family growing up is kind of be quiet about your identity, because we don't want to sort of ruffle any feathers or create any turbulence. And because I guess I grew up in that post generation and started to sort of feel into this sense of self-actualization, if you will, from the 60s and 70s, I just felt I wanted to rebel against all that. And so, in fact, when I did my undergraduate at Cambridge in England, I was kind of hanging out with anarchists and living in a squat, trying to just recognize that this society that we'd lived in was just so screwed up. And in fact, I came to the United States to just get out of sort of Margaret Thatcher's England and this country that I felt was stuck in its imperialist past. But little did I know I was coming into Reagan's America at the time. It was an interesting sort of path I went through, because I partnered with somebody and married somebody who'd been through the whole hippie generation and had traveled all over South America and had a deep sense of what was wrong with the world. But she wanted her kids, who became my stepkids, to have a good start in life, if you will, in the more conventional American mainstream way. So I did a U-turn, got an MBA, actually studied at the University of Chicago, the home of Milton Friedman and the whole neoliberal worldview. And I found myself embedded for years of my life right in the heart of that sort of corporate monster, if you will. That and actually in inculcated in myself this sense of, oh, wow, it's amazing that some of these capitalist ethics, that everyone looking out for themselves actually works for the best benefit of all. Because that's the beautiful, the way in which the invisible hand works. And I bought into that. And I actually ended up living that life for a while, ended up starting an internet company, took it public, went through the whole capitalist phase of the dot-com boom. And it was only after my first wife, because she passed away some years back, she got very sick and seriously ill. And I left my company to look after her. The company collapsed. I kind of lost her years before she even died, because she went through a period of really sort of cognitive, deep sort of challenges, so semi-dementia. And so there I was alone with everything I'd built around me seemingly crashed. And that was where I went through my own internal investigation. And I said, like, what is, this question of who am I? What is my sense of self? But above all, there was this question about meaning. What is meaningful in life? I built up a set of values that then crashed around me. I didn't want to take anybody else's word. And then in this part of the next part of my life, what was meaningful? So I ended up doing this deep exploration to try to understand for myself, what is that about? What is meaning about? What's a path that actually truly is meaningful, which leads to these big questions about the self, and led me to understand how there are such different ways of making sense of our reality. So much so that, in fact, now a lot of my time is spent trying to offer in my writing, in my and what I talk about, for people to recognize it doesn't have to be this way. For us as individuals, it doesn't have to be that way, to be stuck in that sense of self. And as a society, as a culture, these things that we take for granted are not just dangerous, leading us to destruction. They're not even true. They're not even scientifically true, never mind from any kind of broader perspective. So I've been through a lot of changes in my own life in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It makes me think of something I write about in Facing the Climate Emergency, How to Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. The idea of grieving the future that you thought you had as a part of the pathway into actually like making a positive difference for the climate emergency, that that we have to recognize that for me, growing up in the 90s, I was told the future is bright. There's going to be progress. And I had a life plan and it seemed good. But by realizing how bad and accelerating the climate emergency was, I had to realize that all my like lovely plans weren't gonna happen. And it seems like you had a similar experience of, you were on the, whatever capitalist road, but crashed, and like, okay, this way doesn't work. It's not, so you've mentioned like the science of a more connected sense of self. And I'd like to hear about that, and also start to elaborate the kind of the alternative to this American me first.
Yes.
thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks. And just to mention this new book that I'm coming out with is going to be published in June, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, looks in detail at exactly these questions about how these fundamental things we're told about ourself and our sense of identity, who we are, where we are, those big existential questions of life, how the modern mainstream answer to those questions are just absolutely wrong. So one example of that is, everywhere we go, everything we read, we're told about how ultimately humans are kind of selfish, rational individuals. And that's, and the reason communism didn't work is because it tried to posit this other view of humans as being like this part of this big collective. And that's just not true. And that's why it just kind of failed. All these things, these are the things that we see everywhere around us. Well, one thing that cognitive anthropologists and evolutionary biologists have now shown time and time again is that actually what makes humans unique among other primates is that we developed a sense of a shared identity, like starting about 4 to 8 million years ago as we diverged from other primates. We actually the way that we learned how to deal with this kind of dangerous savanna where we couldn't just kind of swing and hide in a tree or whatever was to actually work together as community. And so we evolved over millions of years those pre-human hominids who were overly selfish and overly into especially on the male side, wanted to just dominate, like a Trumpian type of individual would actually not do well in society. They'd be ostracized, and at worst the whole community would gang up together and actually kill them if necessary, to actually have more stability among humans. And so we developed these kind of moral emotions, these things that they don't just come out of our head. Like you'll see people like Richard Dawkins, who has been incredibly successful at embedding in the popular mind this sense of what's supposed to be a scientific understanding of human beings. Talks about the selfish gene, and in his book he actually writes, but we as humans can overcome that selfish gene. We can go through this battle and use our higher rationality to recognize we don't have to be subject to that selfishness or whatever. But this is a complete misconception of how humans actually work. Actually, we feel our sense of compassion. We feel a sense of shared identity. We feel a sense of outrage when we see something being done that's wrong or unfair. And these are things that we evolved over millions of years, which is why there's this kind of gut feeling we have when we see somebody like a Trump or just any kind of community situation where you have we'll use words like asshole or whatever for people who act in ways that aren't truly sharing about their community. So what's so fascinating is that we have our mainstream culture inculcating in us from infancy onwards, through TV, through media, through everything else, that we're actually meant to be one way, when our true human instinct is to be another way. Our true human instinct is to actually connect with people, to actually want to be part of community and of the living earth. And then we're told that humans are separate from nature. We're told that, there's this kind of human uniqueness, that soul that we were talking about before that gets us to heaven, is what makes humans separate from nature, which led to this whole Western notion of seeing nature as nothing other than a machine that we can just exploit. Whereas actually the reality is that we share the vast bulk of our way of being, of our existence, is what we share with all of nature, that nature has this deep animate intelligence that we have too. And once we begin to recognize that, which leads to your next question, we can begin to have a different sense of a self, like what a deep ecologist Arne Ness talked about as an ecological self, a sense of ourself as being part of the entire living earth. A recognition that actually what makes me alive is the fact that I am alive, the fact that I have life within me. It's like all life around, and recognizing it's not that I need to sort of act in the interests of the living earth because it's being destroyed, but I am life. And once we get to that deeper sense of identity, we start to share that sense of what all of Gaia, what the living earth is going through right now, leads to a very different way of relating.
Yeah, one thing I want to add, as you say, we're bombarded in the United States and I know many other countries with, you're greedy and, get yours and all these messages. I think another process that's happening is that we kind of twist ourselves into pretzels to justify unjustifiable conditions and situations. Like, for example, people who grow up wealthy and, for example, have, several nannies and housekeepers and people who are often the closest relationships to this child are hired help and live in much worse conditions than the child, and are maybe bossed around or treated badly. And what is the child supposed to understand from that? They say, well, I must be better than these people.
Right.
There must be something wrong with them. Like, because you can't expect a child to say, wow, this system is really messed up,
That's right.
so, and even on the level of, walking around and regularly seeing homeless people, how are we supposed to like deal with that on an emotional level? I think the way so many people do is will either like kind of create a hard exterior, like nothing touches me, like I'm or they say like, well, they're bad people, and therefore I'm not going to feel what is so natural to feel, which is like heartbreak.
That's right. That's right. And the same is true and the microcosm and the macrocosm. And what you're describing is that you walk in the street, especially in the United States, where there's so much terrible homelessness. Here in the Bay Area, where I live, out of control, where you have these mega billionaires and some of the wealthiest people the world has ever seen, and yet they've managed to change, organize the tax code so that the city doesn't even have enough money to find housing for people who have been just left to the detritus of society there on the streets. It's just heartbreaking. And then you get in this place like, do you give money to this person? What good does that do? So you sort of put these boundaries around yourself, and you try to sort of then, if you do care, you try to kind of convert that into like, we have to shift the system, we have to change the system. But that's still, that person, that living person is still there, suffering right there. You look at him in the eyes. Do you avoid looking him in the eyes? Do you recognize this person as a person? But then on the macrocosm, the same thing with the living earth. Once you get to this place of a larger sense of self, which takes a lot of work to do to unravel this kind of hard edge that we're told about us. But of course, many people watching this conversation right now are here because you have most likely come to some sense of a broader sense of yourself. But when you get to that place, when you begin to connect with the earth as a living earth, that causes its own pain. Like there was this great slogan I saw in Paris in COP 25 some years ago, saying we're not fighting for nature, we are nature defending itself, which I love. But when you recognize that, you begin to feel the actual pain of the destruction taking place. And while we're right to focus on climate breakdown as the absolute existential emergency facing, that is potentially derailing all of civilization, we have to look even broader at the ecological degradation that's going along right now. And not just the sixth extinction that many of us are now aware of, but just the absolute depredation of any aspect of life. So even those species that's still around, 90% of them in many cases have already been lost, and they're being lost at a greater and greater, faster and faster pace. That we're basically, this civilization is literally like destroying the richness, the abundance of life on this earth. And once we begin to feel ourselves as life, the heartbreak is right there. I expect many people have experienced, who in this conversation today experienced what I've experienced at times. It feels so deep that you can't even go there. Like, it's just this absolute engulfing of like, oh my God, how can we be doing this? And it's so vast, like over hundreds of millions of years, here we are destroying what life, this diversity, this beauty that life has put out there. So it takes a lot to face into that. And so it's very natural to not go to that place because it's so painful. And that's where the danger is that, just like with a homeless person on the street, we then sort of push away from it and don't read the next article about the devastation, or don't go to those places emotionally which lead to that. But that's where I feel community is so all important, because we need to recognize, and this is the part of this sense of breaking out of our sense of individual self. None of us can face that individually alone. None of us are meant to be facing that individually alone. What we have available to us is community, is to actually hold the suffering of others in our own hands, and to actually be with others, and to, like, by sharing that, and sharing that not just to then suffer together and feel like, okay, now we can feel this sense of loss together. By sharing that and moving that into engagement and into action is the way to actually be with that suffering in a way that life wants us to do. Life is asking us, life is once we realize we are life, that's who we are, we need to listen to what life is saying. What life is saying is, take your energy, take whatever you have to offer in the world and engage in it. Sure, feel into the suffering, but then move on and feel into the potential, feel into the possibility. Put your life energy into actually striving for life to, like, turn where this civilization is going.
That reminds me, I mean, it's very much the same message that Pope Francis gave in Laudato Si, where he said we need to feel the pain of the earth so that we might see what we can do about it. And also my book is really trying to help people on that journey, and especially, like, bearing the unbearable, because when you really look at the extinction rates and the trajectory of climate, I mean, I use the word apocalypse. That's what we're looking at. We will, if we continue on this trajectory, we will lose everything. And I don't mean other people far away. I mean us, and you, me, my family, your family, everybody, and the whole human family, and the larger extended family of all life. It is all threatened. And I mean, what could be more painful?
Mm-hmm.
So in asking people to leave the, like, illusion, the of the self, right? I'm just me living my life on a relatively stable planet with a okay political system, or what, like, to realize, oh, actually I'm living on the precipice of the apocalypse. And it's, I mean, it takes real courage to be able to look at reality and feel all of that pain.
Yes, I think it does. It absolutely takes courage, and I think the path to be able to be with that is ultimately to focus on this sense of connectedness, and that's actually a big theme that comes through my upcoming book, is really recognizing our worldview, our current worldview, is all about separation. And the antidote to that is to focus on connectedness. And that has a lot of different nuances to it. So, for example, it's very easy, when we're looking at the destruction and the way in which this growth-based global economy keeps growing faster and faster, even in the wake of all this destruction, it's easy to just say at some point, we're headed for catastrophe. There's really nothing we can do, to actually make that shift. So that's one form of disconnectedness. At that point, it's like, I as a person am separating myself from this sort of thing I'm looking at, as if I'm sort of 30,000 miles out in space looking down at Earth and saying, well, there's nothing I can do. But actually, the future is what we all create. We co-create through our connectedness with each other. So every one of us has basically an ability to be involved, to actually make a difference through our interconnection, not through some sort of hero approach of like, oh, I'm going to solve the problem myself, but through recognizing that by connecting with the forces that are for life, we can actually make a difference. And there's also this moral obligation to do that. we are, as life, we, especially those who have had the privilege to actually be here in life where we can actually, make a difference and have some of the power for whatever reasons that just the lottery of nature gave us in this society. It's imperative on us to actually recognize that and use that power we have for that positive way. But equally important is then to not get too disconnected from those who don't see that. There's danger also in othering those who are part of that hedonic treadmill, those who, whatever, 70 million Trump supporters who voted for the Republicans in the United States, and people all around the world who who is still living this life of separation and feeling they need to look out for themselves. And I think it's so important to not, and here's one of these important distinctions. One of the concerns I have about the potential dangerous path with a new administration is the focus on unity could lead potentially to compromise. Like, oh, well, let's listen to what the other views in the room and let's find some approach which the majority of people can be comfortable with, all this kind of stuff. That's not the kind of connection I'm talking about. If you have somebody saying there's no such thing as climate change, you don't try to find unity and connection by saying, well, we believe there's climate change, you believe there's not, so let's kind of find some middle ground and say, well, maybe there is, and maybe it's not, no, we have to focus on the emergency of what's needed and not compromise in those specific areas. But we do need to reach into the heart of those people who don't recognize some of these things and not other them, and find ways for them to actually feel invited to join into that a positive future. Find ways for people to connect with things that matter to them. Maybe it's their grandchildren. Maybe it's their sense of enjoying going fishing, whatever it might be. But actually connect with people so they feel even people we feel on the other side generally want to feel good about themselves. The reason they might end up being part of some sort of fascistic type of behavior is because they've been pounded on them for years not to feel good about themselves. So they've just tried to find some way they can belong to something so they can. We need to offer people on-ramps to belong to something that's bigger, that's more life-affirming. So these are some of the ways I think that we can really focus on connection, not just with our own connection with the living earth, but connection with a human community to shift people towards that real focus on a positive future.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to take this opportunity to share a few words about something I've been working on and invite the audience to take part in, which is I've been hosting small group conversations, hosting them through a software that allows me to host them like in absentia. So the small group calls in and then they see a few videos of me and then they answer discussion prompts. So I'm talking about, the importance of sharing emotions. And then there's a prompt like, how do you feel about the climate emergency and so forth. So participants get to explore these issues and the pain that we've been talking about, but do it together. Because often it can be too much to do all alone. And many people don't have people in their lives that they can have these conversations with. So I just wanted to invite the audience to go to climateawakening.org and you can sign up to join one of these conversations. They've been going really, really well so far. People, it's in a sense very simple, just like, how do you feel about the trajectory that we're on? What do you think the future holds? What's it like to talk about that? It's not, but it's just such important topics that are like ignored almost everywhere else. So yeah, that's one way that that I've been working on to help people connect and like shift more into a mindset of connectedness, responsibility, for the idea of oneself as a change agent, right? Like and even like maybe that's why we're here. Like why were you born at the time you were born, like at this, right at the edge of this apocalypse? Maybe it's because you're meant to play a critical role. So yeah, so let me thanks for letting me announce that, and let me ask about COVID. How do you think this pandemic has affected this sense of self?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and because there's a bit of a paradoxical way in which I think our sense of self has been shifted by the pandemic. Because, in one respect, it's shown the even greater separations that exist in our society that have just become so extreme. So the separations of these inequalities of wealth or access to healthcare, or all those different things, so that actually, in some ways, we're even more aware of how one group in society lives one way, another group lives another way, and not just from the health aspect, but just the economic aspect. So even while more than 50 million people have lost their jobs, the billionaires actually increased their wealth. Overall, I think the United States billionaires increased their wealth by about $1 trillion in this last year, while almost everybody else is suffering these incredible consequences economically of what's going on. So there's this huge disparities we see. And then there's been these real positive developments in terms of a sense of shared community, a sense of collaboration. So whether it's like scientists around the world collaborating to work together, just basically ignoring some of the bullshit going on to say, let's work together to come up with the best vaccines or whatever they might be. And then compassionate community of communities forming, saying, like, the state's not helping us, country's not helping us, we're going to help each other. Not so much necessarily focusing on charity, but focusing on actually shared help, actually communities recognizing we need to take power into our own hands to look after each other. That very sense of that human caring about community that evolved in us millions of years ago that we were talking about has come out even more strongly. And interestingly, because of our difficulties in being able to access each other physically in community space, there's also been this kind of greater a sense of a global identity. Thanks, of course, to this wonderful program of Humanity Rising and other things like this notion of we as a human community can begin to extend even further our sense of identity as a whole global planetary consciousness. So I think we're seeing there's something we've seen in the last few decades, this kind of sense of planetary consciousness. You could call it, some people call it cosmo-localism, some people call it globalism. So they actually got slightly different meanings, but the same sort of concept of that we look at our roots in community, and we also look at this kind of cosmopolitanism, this sense of being a part of shared humanity on this earth. That's the way in which actually we have a chance to shift the direction of the way the world's going in by getting both local and global. And I think the COVID has actually has pushed both of those directions for us in terms of this need to focus on our community self-help and this recognition of a wider global community. So that's one way in which I see it. I'm curious what your thoughts are, Margaret.
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree with what you've said. I think the experience of isolation from other people is pretty extreme in a lot of for many, and I know for myself, it's really been a bit of a wake up call. Like I'm kind of a loner, like oh, want to go to this party or something like, I don't know, man. Um, and so this has been one of the first times in my life that I have been like, wow, I really miss people. I really do want to go to the party. I really, um,
Yeah.
and so that's been interesting. And I doubt I'm the only one who, when you lose something is often when you can realize how incredibly valuable it is, and it always was, but you took it for granted. Um, and I think that also in the climate conversation, eh, there is such a concern, a taboo even about like sacrifice. The idea that like even the Green New Deal, which I support, is kind of guilty of this. They want to say it's going to be great. There's going to be jobs and there's going to be, new technology and we're going to stop climate change. It's going to be great. But they don't want to talk about sacrifice, giving things up, not everybody having a car, not everybody, whatever. I mean, the having convenient, takeout, delivery, or whatever. I mean, like, and I personally think that in order to cancel the apocalypse and restore a safe climate, we can't keep living anyway. I mean, in the way that we do in Western countries, especially wealthy people. Like it's just not there. There will be sacrifices, but they're so easy compared to what we've sacrificed with COVID. So easy, so small. I mean, when's the last time you saw your, members of your family,
Mhm.
right? Like that, whatever. So anyway, that's a big one for me. Is like look at how much people are willing to change their lives to deal with an emergency. We can do this, and it'll be so much better because yeah, we won't have some of the conveniences and whatever tropical vacations and stuff, but we could be together.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was just thinking about that word sacrifice, which if you look at the actual roots of it, it's this notion of making something sacred. It's like, it comes from the sense of being part of a religious ritual and actually offering something to something that is truly spiritually meaningful, making it sacred as a result of that by sacrificing it. And in a way, that's kind of a nice way to look at this notion, because in a way, it's not like we're giving something up that makes our lives worse. What we're doing is substituting things that actually cause us to be just conditioned by this hedonic treadmill and to be permanently dissatisfied by always on this rush for something more and bigger and everything else, and actually substituting that with actually growing the quality of our lives. So one way that I like to talk about it is basically we need to grow the quality of our lives rather than the quantity of our lives. And that's where there's a movement that's especially strong in Europe called the degrowth movement, which looks clearly in the face of this reality that most people are afraid to look at, which is that we have to halt this growth-based economy. There's no such thing as green growth. That's just this myth that maybe some entrepreneurs, people like to talk about because it makes them feel better, and that's been shown to not be true. We have to actually turn around from that growth to a degrowth in society. But I think that the actual labeling of degrowth, I have severe difficulty with, because I don't think you're going to inspire hundreds of millions of people around the world to say, yes, we're for this degrowth. But the whole point is that what we can be growing is the quality of our lives instead. And that's where I think what's so important is to realize that in each of these cases, we're not actually giving something up. We're actually improving on something. So rather than like driving around on my own in some big car, I actually have the ability, we as a society can invest in real wonderful public transport. So, and I can actually connect with people as I'm traveling and actually make my life a lot easier and a lot more hassle-free. And for takeout food, I actually can bring my jar to a restaurant, just like before modern society took over, and somebody can actually serve me food back in my glass jar, which I can take back, and I can enjoy these things without necessarily causing this kind of mindless destruction of the environment that's around. So in each case, there are opportunities to actually transform what we're doing in ways that feel better. For me personally, I spent most of my life being a meat eater, and I love nothing more than a good hamburger or a good steak. And as recognizing the impact of beef on our climate, and also recognizing the incredible cruelty that goes along with that, I no longer eat meat. But what I've discovered is how wonderful some of these kind of vegan alternatives are. So I don't even feel a sense of sacrifice anymore. I feel, well, I'm so glad I'm actually eating something that actually in many ways tastes better, feels better to my body, and I'm able to make that change. So I think that's the way we need to look at these things.
Yeah, so my father is a psychoanalyst. So when I was growing up, by far the main way we talked about growth was this idea of internal growth, maturation, the ability to, not be paralyzed by depression and anxiety or whatever, and that kind of growth in, in internal qualities, in knowledge, in art and skills. This is all infinite, right? We can so it's let's grow those things, and let's grow our relationships, and and these things are actually, again, the secret is they're actually a lot better than the stuff that we've been sold as the things that we should be focused on growing.
Yeah. I think that's right. And just keeping an eye on the time right now and seeing that we're getting close to when I think we should be stopping this portion of the conversation. I guess just one thing I just kind of wanted to add to people as we're looking at this is this notion of self that we've been talking about. This real sense that we actually can make a difference in that shared community, the very kind of thing that you're offering, Margaret, with the new project, and this recognition of this non-linearity of this change, and the non-linearity of what we're doing as part of this deeply interconnected system. So we can get away from this thing of, well, is just one tiny me and 8 billion people, how can I make a difference? By engaging in the right way, engaging for life, we can resonate through that system in ways that we may never even know how much power we have to actually be part of that transformative change.
I agree with that. I would like to put a little bit more specifics on there, because I think there can be a bit of a danger of spiritual bypass kind of thing. I cultivate positivity in myself, and I put out good energy or whatever. And I would really like to invite everyone to join the climate emergency movement, right? Go and build power and organize and change policies, and cultivate positive energy within yourself, and that kind of thing too. But there is a real world to win out there. So it's this flow of your feelings and your energy and everything you have to offer, and you put it into the real world and the movement.
That's great. I'm with you, Margaret.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, this has been great. Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much, Jim, for inviting us, and thank you to everyone for participating. I'm sorry I was really not able to keep up at all with what's been happening in the chat. I see some awesome engagement, but it's just too fast to be responsive. But it's what I can see from that is that it's obviously a very engaged and open group. So thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Margaret, and everyone who's been engaged in this conversation.
Yes, thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Jeremy. I've been profoundly moved by your discussion because I think what you're pointing to is the central challenge of grappling with climate change, that it is forcing us to redefine and reimagine literally what it means to be human. As you pointed out, Jeremy, Margaret, we've been developing these rapacious, exploitative patterns of behavior for millennia. And we just assumed that nature was there for us to exploit. And because nature didn't seem to do anything back, we just kept going. And our very definition of progress, of evolution, has been cultivated on the erroneous assumption that we are different from nature. And so I think the depth to which you've engaged with us today is really the challenge before us. It's one thing to join the Paris Climate Accord. It's another thing to begin to redefine the very notion of what progress means. It is no longer just more goods and consumption, but it has to be around how do we develop progress in human thriving, in the quality of life rather than the quantity of goods in the gross domestic product index that the countries use to measure progress. And just imagine the progress, the growth that would ensue if every country in the world put itself on a war footing to retool its economy, to retool its infrastructure, to retool its education around climate change and the movement into regenerative economics, donut economics, where human thriving is at the center and ecological systems and constraints are then viewed as the context. Because as you both pointed out, we are nature defending itself. And that's why, Margaret, I think, the bottom line is your point right at the end. We have to be careful about engaging in a spiritual bypass. It's not enough to just feel good about yourself or even to be a vegetarian, which most of us are for the reasons you stated, Jeremy, but to actually get involved in the climate emergency. And that's one reason why Humanity Rising was put in motion. It's why time and time again we return to the climate issue, and you've done splendidly today, and we'll hope to have you back down the trail. But every single person needs to get actively involved. In the same way we saw in the US election, which in the face of the pandemic, in the face of all kinds of manipulation of the post office and the suppression of votes and the denigration of the electoral process, the American people turned out not only in record numbers to vote, but in record numbers to participate in the vote counting process to ensure that everything maintained the integrity it needed to have a transparent, fair, and credible election. It was because millions of people turned out and actually did something around that election. And we need to now, as we face the future, understand that the climate emergency is at the heart. We talk about heart coherence. This island of heart coherence that we are trying to cultivate is in a sea of rising chaos around climate. If we solve climate, everything else relaxes. If we do not solve climate, everything else is exacerbated. And that's why the scientists are telling us that we have less than 10 years to really put our minds in order, as we've discussed today, and our hands to the till to really make the difference that we need to make. So thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Jeremy. I want to welcome everyone to our after session chat. And I want to say that tomorrow we will be not having Charles Eisenstein. He'll be in about 10 days' time. We wanted to commemorate January 22nd as the first implementation of a international treaty fostered by the United Nations to stop, to ban nuclear weapons. And because tomorrow is the day that it goes into effect, we're having Cynthia Lazaroff back, who you may remember did our commemorations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki last year, the 75th anniversaries of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as passionately involved in the nuclear weapons issue. So we thought we would commemorate that on the day that the treaty goes into effect. And if you think about it, climate change and nuclear weapons, those are the only two phenomena that can literally destroy the world as we know it. And they're, in our minds, the two single most important priorities for the Biden administration and for the world governments to deal with, to ensure the continuity and the prosperity of humankind on this beautiful planet. So thank you, everyone. See you in the after session chat. And Margaret and Jeremy, brilliant job, deep, profound, and provocative. And we thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see you.
So-
Bye, everyone.
Bye.